Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good middle of the night, wherever you are in the world. My name is Dermot Campbell-Lendrum. I'm the head of the Climate Change and Health Unit at the World Health Organization in Geneva, and I'll be your moderator for this exciting PMAC webinar on Building Back Better, a healthier and greener world after COVID-19. We have a really exciting panel to address this question with us. And I have to say that from the World Health Organization point of view, this is a really interesting and important question. At the moment, we have the World Health Assembly going on virtually behind me, if you like, here at WHO. And the eyes of the world are on dealing with COVID-19, with the very hopeful news that we seem to have a good candidate vaccine, perhaps more in the pipeline, so that we can hopefully see the end of this at the end of this crisis. And yet, at the same time, we have to consider the world that we will come into after COVID-19. And despite all of the disruption and the massive human toll that COVID-19 has taken, my suspicion is that the longer term effects, the larger effects on global health will actually be determined by the response that we are making and that we will make to the COVID-19 crisis. From our point of view at WHO, we're already working on this. And with quite a close match to the title of this webinar, in May, we published a manifesto for a healthy and green recovery from COVID-19 with 6 prescriptions, as we call them. So briefly, they're protecting nature, providing essential services such as water and sanitation, electricity access, fueling the rapid transition to clean, green energy sources to start to head off the threat of climate change and save millions of lives from air pollution, provide sustainable, healthy food systems, build livable cities, and finally stop subsidizing pollution in the way that we're currently doing, either directly or failing to take into account the impact of polluting energy sources on our health. So we have quite a firm position on this, and that's exactly the reason why it's of such interest to us to host this webinar in collaboration with the PMAC partners, and as I say, to have a fantastic panel to discuss this with us. We have hopefully allowed a good amount of time for discussion, so we'd like to encourage you, everybody who's attending this virtually, to submit any questions that you may have in the Q&A box, and then we'll be able to deal with them either directly in response to presentations that will be made, or in hopefully the good half hour or so that we've left at the end of this session for interactive discussion with the audience. We also, at the end of the session, will ask you to complete a very quick, a very short feedback questionnaire, which will take you through at the end of the session. And just to introduce what we have by way of format, we have 2 keynote presentations, which I'll introduce as the speakers come up. And then, unfortunately, our second presenter will have to leave us after just over half an hour, but we'll then take the other 2 presentations and then bring the 3 panelists who will still be with us back together for a virtual discussion with me and with you as the audience. So with that, I'll take us straight into our first speaker, and we're absolutely delighted to have Professor Johan Rockstrom with us. His name will be familiar to many of you if you work on global environmental change. He is the director of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research and a professor in Earth System Science at the University of Potsdam, and he's perhaps best known for leading the development of the Planetary Boundaries Framework for Human Development in the current era of rapid global change. With that, over to you, Professor Rockstrom.
Thanks, Dermot, and hello, everyone. Okay, so what I'd like to do in this 10-minute slot before our dialogue is to make the scientific case for the high risk of systemic challenges we're facing, but also, let me see, there we are, starting the video as well. There we are. But also look ahead at what can be the windows opening up towards a transition towards a sustainable, prosperous, and fair future for humanity within a safe operating space on Earth. I think it's truly fair to say that we are seeing a very significant momentum in the world on a transition to sustainability. Right as we speak, we have a G3 on climate emerging with the three largest economies in the world, the European Union, China, and the US, committing in line with science towards net zero emission of greenhouse gases by 2050 in just 30 years' time. Biden has set up this commitment. Xi Jinping has pointed out that China is now on a track to deliver net zero no later than 2060, and the European Union has a 55% reduction scheme the next 10 years, the decisive decade, and net zero by 2050. This is significant on climate, but we all know that we have enormous amount of science on the table to show that we will fail on the Paris targets of staying well below 2 and aiming for 1.5, unless we also are able to secure the resilience and sustainability across all the planetary boundaries, which interact very closely with health. The reason for this is that we can today also unequivocally conclude that we've entered the Anthropocene, the geological epoch where we humans dominate as the largest force of change on Earth. The scale, speed, and interconnectivity explains the pandemic. It explains global warming. It explains that we're in the sixth mass extinction of species. The pandemic was therefore not a surprise. It is part of a global systemic risk landscape with three crises occurring simultaneously: the health crisis, the climate crisis, and an ecosystem crisis. Now, this is best explained scientifically on climate with this following very recent update. For the first time, a climate model at my institute, at the Potsdam Institute of Climate Impact Research, has been able to reproduce the oscillation of the planet between ice ages and interglacials over the last 3 million years. That's what you see here on the x-axis, 3 million years, the entire Pleistocene epoch. On the y-axis, you have deviation from global mean temperature. The 0 point is the pre-industrial average temperature on Earth. What you see here in green is that not at one time during the last 3 million years has the global mean temperature on Earth gone beyond 2 degrees Celsius. We've stayed below 2 degrees right through this entire period, which is the only period of planet Earth's history that resembles the Earth as we know it, with all the ecosystems, the hydrological cycle, the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, the phosphorus cycle, the planetary boundaries as we know it. What does this tell us? Well, it tells us two things. One is that going beyond 2 degrees Celsius is very risky indeed. We haven't been there for the past 3 million years. But more importantly, it tells us, why is this happening? How come the planet stays within this incredibly narrow corridor, plus 2 degrees, the warmest temperature we have experienced right through the entire Earth period, the last 3 million years, -4 deep ice age? Well, it's because we've stayed within the planetary boundaries. It is the ability of the Earth system to dampen stress and shocks by absorbing carbon dioxide, absorbing heat, reflecting back heat on ice sheets, staying as a self-regulating biogeochemical system. When it comes to the interactions with the pandemic, we know that when we put pressure on the Earth system, it's not only that we are at risk of knocking it out of its stable state during this 3 million year period, because we are on a pathway that would take us well outside of the narrow corridor, but it also has direct health impacts. This is a curve that I'm sure you're all so well familiar with the zoonotic viral infection increase over the last 30 years, which is another one of the hockey sticks. And we know that the reason for this is the increased penetration of human exploitation of natural habitats in ecosystems, meaning that unsustainable exploitation of ecosystems combined with risky behavior on wildlife trade and wet markets in a hyper-connected world is what increases risks of pandemics. So again, it's no surprise. We have transformed to a point where 96% of the living weight of biomass on Earth is today us humans and livestock. Only 4% is wild mammals. This is the drama on sustainability, health, trajectory that we're facing today, because many of these diseases pass via livestock. That is the realities we're seeing today. This is well anchored in science. IPBS, the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, just a few weeks back, emphasized exactly this point. If you want to have a resilient recovery post-COVID, you want to invest in nature. You want to keep ecosystems intact to avoid future spillovers of virus in zoonotic infectious disease outbreaks. We also know that the health links are so strong in terms of air pollution. We see infectious diseases like COVID being lung infections, which directly hit harder on particularly urban dwellers with low lung capacity because of poor air quality caused by fossil fuel burning. So we have perfect storms kind of establishing itself of unhealth, pandemic risks, and global warming. And the global warming is today at 1.2 degrees Celsius. You may wonder, is this a disaster point for humanity? Well, it's not, but we're seeing the invoices being sent throughout this super year 2020, which crashed down because of COVID. It was the year when we were supposed to bend the global curve of emissions, and it's another year of extremes. Heat wave in Europe, the second one in a row, just in the last 5 years, the unprecedented forest fires in Australia, the zombie fires of permafrost methane release in the Arctic, and the floods in Bangladesh. And today we're seeing the amplified storm patterns in both typhoons in Asia and hurricanes in the North Atlantic down to the Caribbean Sea. This is all evidence we have today, summarized so well by the sister organization to WHO in the WMO on the United in Science 2020. I really recommend this document as a summary of all the impacts we're seeing already at 1.2 degrees. But that is not my biggest worry. My biggest worry is that we are on a trajectory where we over the next 10 years are at risk of pushing on buttons of irreversible changes that could make the Earth system drift away far from the corridor that we've been staying within for the last 3 million years. The last summary for this was presented just before COVID, where we now have evidence that 9, and these are the 9 you see on the screen here, 9 of the big systems on Earth that regulates the state of the planet, that have tipping points. They can shift from rainforest to savanna, from stable ice to unstable ice, from stable ocean conveyor belts to slow down changing regional weather patterns. 9 of these 15 are showing signs of being on the move. Being on the move means that we cannot exclude that they're approaching tipping points. Just have a look at this map. You see how the Greenland ice sheet is melting faster than predicted, how the Arctic is melting faster than predicted, both impacting on the Atlantic circulation of heat in the North Atlantic, impacting on rainfall patterns in the Amazon. The Amazon has today such reduction in rainfall that 40% of the forest is in a multiple state at risk of tipping over into a savanna state. And all of this leads to more warm surface water being stored in the southern ocean, which accelerates the melt in the West Antarctic ice shelf. Interconnected tipping points, which are today not that they have crossed tipping points, but they are at a warning sign of moving. This is unpublished data, which I think is relevant for the dialogue here. What you see here is the vulnerability map socioeconomically, a well-established map. The redder, the more vulnerable the economies. The black dots are the regions that today have annual mean temperatures exceeding 29 degrees Celsius, the point above which it's physiologically threatening human life. The squared lines you see here is the projection if we continue business as usual, and that would be the estimate of the regions that will have annual mean temperatures above 29 degrees Celsius by 2070, in just 50 years' time. Can you imagine people living in this region, which will host today more than 1 billion people, living in areas that physiologically are too hot for human health? This is a risk of geopolitical instability across the world. And we see these kind of perfect storms playing out already today. This is the desert locust, drought-stricken, food riot-prone regions of 2020, when we have, in the midst of the COVID-19, people who cannot find food because of 2 years of drought colliding with the desert locust invasion. This is the kind of situation we do not want to experience. So it's not a coincidence that countries have declared climate emergencies. We're even having to consider a state of planetary emergency and the need to transition across not only climate, but also planetary boundaries and health. That is why seeking our pathway to a safe operating space is critical on the biophysical systems on Earth. It is a sustainability transformation. It's not only about decarbonizing the world economy, shown here in the gray curve, but it's also about a transition in food system from source in dark brown to sink in orange. But it's also about keeping the carbon sinks in the natural ecosystems intact in green and blue. So this is a sustainability transformation that is entirely targeted in human well-being and health. So this Monday, the whole Race to Zero kicked off. That's the momentum we're seeing. We're seeing this momentum across the world building up, leaving to you then for this dialogue the new framing of achieving human well-being and the sustainable development goals within a safe operating space of a stable planet. The only path to stability, but also the only path to a healthy future. Thank you very much. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Professor Rockstrom. That was just a fantastic overview and introduction to the whole Earth system approach and the dependency we have in terms of protecting health on protecting all of those systems, and as you say, staying within those planetary boundaries. I could just ask the audience, if you would like to pose a question to Professor Rockstrom, then please do enter it in the Q&A, and we'll come back to that in the discussion session. If you have a question for our next speaker, please do it during her talk, because we'll have a few minutes with her before she has to leave at the end of her talk. So just to introduce our next speaker, it's a great pleasure to welcome Agnes Kalibata. She is the UN Secretary General's Special Envoy, helping the UN in giving strategic direction towards the 2021 Food System Summit, a massively important conference for us. And she also has served as the president of the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, and prior to that as Rwanda's Minister of Agriculture and Animal Resources. And she'll be talking about one of, if not the most important system on which all human health depends, the food system. So over to you, please, Ms. Kalibata.
Yeah, thank you, moderator, for those introductory remarks. And I'm really happy to be coming after Johan's presentation because it highlights what the key issues are. So I feel relieved because I don't have to go into what are the issues, what is at stake here. I want to brief you on how far we've gone with the summit and how the summit looks at this whole pandemic and the work that is ahead of us that we share. So I was appointed special envoy at the end of last year, and as I was beginning to work, definitely you all know the COVID pandemic hit in early end of last year, beginning of this year, and so a lot of things really were held back by just not knowing what to do next, not knowing whether we'd have the summit or not. But here we are, fast forward. We will definitely have the summit as we had planned. And the COVID-19 pandemic has more than anything really heightened the need for us to have the summit sooner than later, mostly based on the presentation that was just made, but also based on the urgency that the pandemic puts on the table. We know that even before the COVID-19 pandemic, we were living in a crisis, like you just described, Johan. In the climate crisis for us here in Africa is so real because since 2013, we've been seeing increases in number of people that are hungry. We know that 60 million people are more hungry in the last 5 years than we had before. And a lot of it has to do with the climate crisis we are seeing today. So we already knew we were living in a challenge that we need to fix, like you just described. So COVID-19 just highlights everything. So our failing food system, as we know, is very much responsible for some of these infectious diseases that we are seeing that have zoonotic origin, but is also responsible for failing health. We know that 1 in every 3 people are obese. It's also highly responsible for huge global biodiversity loss, and so much more. What is at stake here? Probably I want to highlight 2 things that are very critical at stake here. One is that we are not coming through on a number of SDGs that we said would come through. In a number of them, actually, we are off track, including hunger that I just said. But also we are off track on nutrition indicators, we are off track on biodiversity indicators, and so many other things. We do recognize that to be able to come through on all these things, we need to work with our food systems. We need a food system that is resilient. We need a food system that is inclusive. We need a food system that is sustainable. We need a food system that provides nutrition to all, not a few. COVID-19 has highlighted there are so many people among us that are vulnerable, whose lives have been torn apart because they live on the edge of the lives we have today. We've seen a lot of countries suffer from breakdown of supply chains. We've seen a lot of people suffer from, just the fragility of the jobs they live in. So we really must work with our food systems, and we must work with them, knowing that as we try to fix SDGs, we must fix the fragility of our food systems. So probably those are the two things that are, among other things that were described and said, the 2 things that we must think about as we continue to think about our prospects of building back better. So in terms of the Food System Summit, we've put in place 5 key objectives that we see as driving, as really forging our way forward. Number 1 is definitely fixing the issue of access to safe and nutritious food. Number 2 is dealing with the issue of consumption. We live amidst so much waste in our environment, but also our consumption patterns are not sustainable. I just lost power in my building, so that's why it all went dark. Number 3 is dealing with nature positive production, recognizing that how we produce food and how we manage food all the way from production to fork is contributing significantly to climate change. Number 4 is really thinking through livelihoods and improving livelihoods, a lot of which has been highlighted by COVID-19. And number 5 is thinking through resilience and how we build, we build resilience to shocks in our system, whether it is to COVID or it is to existing challenges that we are already talking about. So that's why the Secretary General has been calling for building back better. And these are all elements of what we must think about as we build back better. So here we must think about some of the critical things that the summit will put on the table is we must think about the evidence and knowledge that needs to be put on the table to help drive the summit. And this is being done through a scientific group. We must think about what it will require to change the trajectory of things today and put us on a transition in our food system. And that is being done through action tracks. That work will be done through action tracks. The action tracks will look at game-changing ideas that are definitely going to be part of the solution that we expect. We must engage lots of people. Nearly everybody in this world has a stake in what's happening. We all eat 3 times a day. By doing that, we are defining our food systems. So we need to engage people. The Secretary General says we must make it a people's summit. To be able to make it a people's summit, we are designing a system that really reaches out far and near. And that mostly is shown through the food systems dialogue we are trying to do at country level. We want to make sure that we have 3 dialogues at country level that will engage people, number 1, at what's at stake, number 2, at the discussions they need to have, number 3, at the solutions we must have and put on the table. But also there will be independent dialogues that will allow people from all walks of life really to sit and discuss and be able to put forward their ideas, whether they are at country level or away from country level. All these things are overseen by an advisory committee that is chaired by the Deputy Secretary General. to ensure that when we do finish the summit, when we do come through, we actually have a set of solutions. We have a set of recommendations, high-level recommendations coming from countries themselves, a high-level set of commitments coming from countries themselves, committing to do things differently to achieve the decade of action. We have 10 years to come from SDGs, but also to do them, recognizing fully well that we are working against a failing food system, and we must find ways of fixing this failing food system. So nearly all these instruments I've told you are already in place. We've already we have a scientific group that is already working. The food systems dialogues are kicking off this month. The action tracks are kicking off, have already kicked off. They've had their first concept papers. We have the UN umbrella coming together under the leadership of UNGA in what we are calling the UN task force. And that is going to ensure that we really bring all the work together from the UN. So much work that is being done by different institutions that needs to be put on the table as well. We are very proud to be working with World Health Organization on the action track on sustainable consumption patterns. We are really proud that you have accepted to put your energies into that. Of course, we do have other UN institutions that anchor the other action tracks as well. And we do actually now have a website where all that information can be found. And what I would like to conclude with is just to recognize and thank you for inviting me. Thank Professor Rockstrom for the presentation he just made, but also for accepting to be part of the championship of the summit, and really encourage you all to find ways of participating in the summit and make sure that whatever ideas are out there, whatever opportunities we see that can change the trajectory of things for our food systems, get put on the table so that they can be discussed. We are fully committed to ensuring that we are engaging everybody. We are fully committed to ensuring that this is not just another summit, and we really look forward to working with you all to make sure that we come through on these things. So I will stop there for now, and like you said, I'll be around for a few more minutes in case people have questions. I will answer them in the chat, and so that I don't interrupt people. Thank you so much for having me again, and I look forward to working with World Health Organization, with UNEP, with you all, to ensure that we come through on this summit. The summit is planned to be in September next year at the UN, but the pre-summit will be in Rome in the summer around July, and will really be the place where we get all these ideas together and drive for the action we want to see. So thank you again, and over to you, moderator.
Thank you very much, Ms. Kalibata. That was fantastic. Just in the few minutes that we have with you, I'll just give one more invitation to our audience if they'd like to send any questions. But I had a couple of sort of questions and reactions. I think it's very clear, there's a very clear diagnosis of the problem, both from Professor Rockstrom's talk overall at the systems level, and then, as you outlined so well, the massive burden that we are suffering, even in health, from getting our food system wrong. That we have, that probably the largest burden of disease is attributable to either undernutrition or overnutrition. And yet, from the health side, most health people and most health effort doesn't go into that. It doesn't go into the determinants. It goes into treating people and ensuring health services and so on. Very important, but it's not actually where the biggest decisions are that affect health. So it's a question to you as to, as you prepare this summit, and as you say, you've identified the issues, what needs to be done about them: access, acting on consumption, nature positive production, livelihoods, and resilience. What would you ask the health community specifically to do? I know everybody needs to be involved. Is there something that you can see for the health community to step up to support you in this work?
Thank you for that question. And before I talk about the health community and what the health community could do, maybe I'll just take it a notch up. It's our countries, our system, our way of thinking needs to be a little bit more than we are working today. Today we think about food, we think about health, we think about environment. We have all these conversations going on in opposite directions. And yet food touches nearly everything. that we're talking about. It impacts our environment, it impacts our health, it impacts nearly everything, our biodiversity, all the things we're talking about. So some countries have already figured it out and have started having integrated strategies and integrated planning. You see this in what EU is trying to do in its Farm to Fork strategy. You see this in what Norway is trying to do with its one strategy around food systems, and many other countries. I could call out a number of countries that are already doing that. So that's really the starting stone, probably the most important. Now, within that, each of our institutions, each of us, agriculture, health, need to be doing something. I think health needs to, probably we need to understand it better from a health perspective. But first of all, we are firefighting, right? So we need to deal with the problem of people that are already obese, or the people that are already suffering, that we need to deal with. But there's also defining the parameters that are critical to our health systems. We know what is causing many of these things. Can we step backwards and help us define, as we go into these action tracks, help us define what does it mean from a nutrition perspective? What does it mean from a health perspective? Is it possible to start drawing, being very clear around the limits of our food system, what should not be and what should be? So for example, I'm thinking about, we all eat a lot of processed food, and our health system could be very categoric around what should not be and what should be. So in terms of real tangible action. So I feel like there's an opportunity here to help lead and define how our private sector will behave with regards to what is acceptable human consumption. There's still, of course, an opportunity to work with us to ensure that we reduce all these vulnerabilities that are existing in our system already. But defining where we shouldn't be going is probably one of the most important things that the health system can help us do, while working with us to set the right policy framework in place so that we prevent where they are working at right now, at the end of the chain, which is already a bit too late.
Perfect, thank you. I think you need to leave us almost now. I'm just going to pitch one final quick question to you. It's one that's come up in the chat, I think, and I think I'll be directing it to all of the participants. And it's effectively, we can see these massive problems. What is the one thing that gives you hope that we can overcome them? I'd say it's a big question for a short answer, but over to you.
So even with this COVID crisis, even with this health crisis, every time mankind is faced with a crisis, we always find a way through. You can already see that people are trying their best to finding their way through, whether it's the vaccine you just talked about that is coming on in such a short period of time, whether it is so many other things that people are putting forward, and whether it is the way we are taking responsibility for each other. I see many countries, we see that happening in a lot of countries. We are definitely going to beat this. And we've done this before. It's not the first time we've been tested, and we've always come out on the other side. So what I'm hopeful, what gives me hope is knowing two things. That one, we are out of time. I think it wouldn't have been put better than the presentation was just put out there. We are out of time. So we don't have a whole lot of options. There's no option B, number one. Number two, we've survived worse things. So here we still have an opportunity to fix what we are living with. So for me, it's our ability to innovate, our ability to be creative, but also knowing that we've run out of time. We definitely can do this. This can't be just another summit. It's one of those where we put our best foot forward and get this work done.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for that, and you can certainly count on WHO's support, and I'm sure the wider health community. So we'll just look forward to working with you as we already are. And just once again, thank you very much for your time. I know you need to go to another meeting.
And thank you for having me. Thank you.
Thank you. It's really been a pleasure. With that, then I'll turn to our next speaker, who is Professor Brahma Kone. He's an associate professor in environmental epidemiology from the African and Madagascar Council for Higher Education. He's also a lecturer of public health at the University Pelefro Gon Coulibaly of Korogo in Côte d'Ivoire. He also has a position at the Centre Suisse de Recherche Scientifique, also in Côte d'Ivoire. And he has other titles, but I'll just give you the last one, Deputy Director in charge of research programs at the Ministry of Higher Education and Scientific Research of Côte d'Ivoire. So Professor Kone, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Dami. So I've been asked to talk a bit on the case of Côte d'Ivoire, how at the national after COVID period, that in order to increase the resilience of our country to such pandemic situations. And of course, that leads me to talk about what has been done so far in our country, mainly in Côte d'Ivoire, to face climate change and all. Yeah, thank you so much. So rapidly, Côte d'Ivoire is in West Africa, 300,000 square kilometers with a coastline of 500 kilometers approximately. So let's move rapidly from that. I will talk a bit on our intended national determining contribution from the Paris Agreement. Since the Paris Agreement, the country decided to reduce by 28% the greenhouse gas emission compared to a scenario as business as usual. And those 28% will be mainly gained through measure in power generation with around 8% reduction. In agriculture and in transport, those three activities, those three sectors will be the main sectors in which Côte d'Ivoire will be working hardly in order to attain its INDC. And what has been done so far is strategy. We have been building, constructing in the last 4 years, an hydroelectric dam to support power need at the country level, and also for interland countries like Mali and Burkina Faso. In agriculture, we have been implementing at the national level a strategy for less extensive agriculture, also encouraging agroforestry, mainly in cocoa production activities, and also strategy on food waste reduction at national level. And as you can see, food waste reduction, we all know that worldwide, 1/3 of food is wasted. And that can be done even in the country when from one part to the other part of the country, the food that is wasted in one part can be needed for the other part of the country. So the country has been really working hardly on that. And each week we have information on how food is costing in different parts of the countries in order for the places where the cost is higher to try to catch food that can be wasted in the other may miss, and where the costs are higher. When it comes to transport, the last 4 years, countries have been investing in loans process for fleet renewal. And that they also decide, we also have a law that now decides that all vehicles that age are up to 5 years may never be imported in the country, as it has been done for the previous years. Many cars are imported from developing countries from Europe, and generally some of those cars were up 5 years old. And now it has been decided at the national level that any car that age is up 5 years can no more be imported in the country. And this, of course, was also associated to a strategy of building a tram, public transportation, improving public transportation to of a level. When it comes to waste management, we have been investing so far in circular economy, having a new engineering landfill for waste management in Abidjan that represent one from 4 challenge we are facing now. And I guess those challenges may also be generalized in some of our developing countries, mainly in West African developing countries. Agriculture, we have been facing, again and again. And so let's just end by saying this is again one challenge also for our countries. Even having 7 minutes webinar is a challenge for us. Even having 7 minute webinar is a challenge for us. So you can imagine whatever challenge we are facing in order to follow international dynamic. How can we finance sustainably in greening our worlds when we can even not make sustainable internet connection? This is a great challenge. So I will end with those words, more clear and to be interacting with you as I would like it to be done. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Brahma. I think everybody in the past few months has spent probably too much time trying to do these kinds of meetings. We're all very familiar with the fact that no meeting ever runs completely smoothly, and I think you bring it together very well at the end, saying, how are we expected to solve climate change or global environmental change, particularly in lower middle income countries, when we sometimes even have problems with basic infrastructure. But nonetheless, I think you've certainly made some very valid and interesting points. And from my point of view, it was actually, I was almost surprised to see the level of intent that you have within Côte d'Ivoire for cutting greenhouse gas emissions, even though it's a low middle income country, which is not the biggest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions at the moment. So in some ways, your country is already going above and beyond, given the constraints, as you point out, that you need to work with. Thank you also for pausing so that we're able to keep enough time for the discussion at the end. So we'll be able to come back and hopefully get your full input to that discussion, which I think will be even the most exciting part of the program. With that, I'll turn to our next speaker. This is Omnia El Omrani, a good friend of us at WHO, working as she does for the International Federation of Medical Students Associations, which have just been a fantastic partner to WHO and a real leader on advocacy and mobilization around climate change and health for at least 10 years now. So we have seen a succession of fantastic representatives from IFMSA, of which Omnia is just the latest. So she is a final year medical student from Egypt, currently working at Ain Shams University Hospital in Cairo. She is the liaison officer for public health at IFMSA, which represents the voice of 1.3 million medical students from 134 countries around the world, and is also the focal point to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, amongst other duties, including co-leading the IFMSA COVID-19 response efforts since March 2020. It's always impressive how many jobs these people can hold down. So over to you, Omnia.
Thank you so much for the wonderful introduction and for having me. So I'd like to start first by my experience as a young medical intern in Cairo. I was really exhausted because I was working in my hospital during COVID. I saw the uncertainty and the influx of patients, but I also realized the threats posed by COVID-19 to my healthcare facility, seeing how unprepared it is to the pandemic, but also how unprepared it is to the future crises, such as the climate crisis. But as a young health advocate in IFMSA, my organization, I was inspired. I was inspired by the global and the local efforts that were led by medical students to address the emergency health needs of their community. And I also realized the opportunities COVID-19 has offered us to drive action and change on climate and health. So I'm going to share a few slides to show you what we have done so far during the pandemic to address climate change. So first of all, since March 2020, we had the opportunity to conduct a comprehensive analysis based on results that we collected for the past year from 112 countries. We wanted to assess how climate change was mentioned or integrated in the medical curriculum. We saw that only 15% of them had a mention of climate change, a very inconsistent mention, I might say. And at the same time, we realized that medical students like myself are not sufficiently taught to address the interdependence between health, environment, and climate change. So we discovered out of the medical schools that we analyzed that only 15% of them had a mention of climate change. And this mention was inconsistent. So we really realized that it would not be possible to shape a green and a healthy recovery without the awareness, the understanding, and the participation of the future health workforce. In order to address this, we had the opportunity to conduct over 30 webinars during the period of the pandemic. In these webinars, we had global health experts teach us about the health impacts as well as the co-benefits of climate change. And we had attendance by over 10,000 of our members to all of these virtual sessions. And at the same time, this really inspired us to create a new 101 manual for our students to design community-based activities on climate and health, both offline and on the ground. And due to the imperative link between climate change and food systems, which has been expressed by our previous panelists, I would like to highlight that we as IFMSA collaborated with the European Institute of Technology, as well as EAT Foundation and 6 top European universities. And we launched the first online course for nutrition for health and sustainability for medical students. And this course is actually starting the end of this month. We are also hoping to share our progress and our feedback during the upcoming UN Food Systems Summit. And at the same time, speaking of food systems, we would like to share another initiative that we have done during the last climate change conference in Madrid. Our medical students realized that food systems and dietary change was not really of equal importance as food production processes when it comes to the climate agenda. That is why we decided to survey delegates that were attending the UN Climate Change Conference. We surveyed country delegates, NGOs, as well as farmers. And we asked them about their perception when it comes to health and dietary change amidst the climate negotiations. We discovered that, and we tried to also introduce the concept of the Eat Lancet Planetary Health Diet, which we believe is really eminent to drive the food system as well as the climate change agenda. So we introduced our participants in that survey to the Planetary Health Diet. Even though only less than 35% of them knew what the Planetary Health Diet is, the majority were very willing to adopt this diet. And they also recognized the importance of health as well as food systems when it comes to the climate agenda. And this really presented a very powerful tool for us to use whenever we want to develop our usual activities, such as developing policy briefs, delivering statements, but also taking our own local action. I cannot end my presentation without giving a few examples of what inspires me most, the local efforts of our medical students around the world. Just during COVID, our medical students in Australia, they conducted a competition. This competition was aimed for students to design their own ways of reducing the carbon emissions of the hospitals that they work in, and to make sure that it is environmentally friendly. And this was right before the release of the WHO guidance for environment-friendly and sustainable healthcare facilities. And at the same time, our medical students in Germany, during the pandemic, they did a virtual Planetary Health Academy, an online series, attended by over 3,000 healthcare professionals and students, and gathering health experts from around the world. Due to its incredible success, they are starting now another Planetary Health Academy, but this time it is in East Africa. Now, I want to leave you with one question. How are you going to work collectively with us, the younger generation, in order to shape a healthier, a greener, and also, as the Prime Minister of Fiji said, a bluer, and most importantly, a resilient post-pandemic recovery? Happy to discuss more during the panel. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Omnia. You've also answered one of the questions I was posing to all panelists. What gives you hope? And in my case, it's usually looking at the next generation, including the next generation of healthcare professionals, and thinking, well, we just have to hold on and try and leave things as well as we can, and then get out of their way. So you, as you know, you have our absolute support, and it's a pleasure to work with you from WHO. Thanks to all of the speakers for keeping to time, and for leaving a good amount of time for discussion. So I'm already getting questions posted up in the chat, which I can relay on. I'd like to invite all of the panelists who are still with us, so Professor Kone and Professor Rockstrom, to kindly rejoin the virtual panel if you like. If you'd like to turn your video and mic and mics back on. And then we can, yes, we can turn to the questions that are being raised. These may or may not come up on your screen, but I'm having questions relayed onto me, and I'll just read the first one of them out. And this is a question from. Oh, there we go. That's an amazing organization. The question that has been presented for Professor Rockstrom specifically. What do you see as the most feasible actions for change, and by whom? And is there an existing multi-sectoral platform for governance with clout? And I think the emphasis is probably on that governance with clout that can actually get something done. So over to you, Professor Rockstrom.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So I think on the first part, we're seeing a rising momentum in the world. I think that is absolutely clear. As I mentioned in the beginning of my talk, I think one of the most potentially significant dynamics we're seeing right now is the establishment of what I would call a G3 for climate, meaning the US, the European Union, and China committing to net zero over the next 30-year period. This is a short enough time horizon to really influence investments in the financial sector, the banking sector, but in particular also CEOs in companies across sectors. And just to give you one example, we're now having science business dialogues with the 5 largest heavy truck manufacturers in Europe, who are increasingly aligning their production schemes and business models with science. And for a sector like the heavy truck industry, 30 years is actually not such a long time, because if you are to be net zero in 30 years' time, it means stopping the sales of heavy fossil fuel driven combustion engine trucks 10 years earlier, 2040, which means to start design them 10 years before that, 2030, which means planning for them 2020. So we are already now in a really kind of acceleration point. Do we have multilateral governance structures to address this? I would argue the answer is no. We're still stuck in a very fragmented nation state structure in terms of governance. The hope there really lies in clubs of high ambition alliances. We have the High Ambition Alliance on climate. We have the High Ambition Alliance on biodiversity. That's a very active group of countries. And my reference to the heavy truck industry can be copied with the keystone actors in the food industry, in the construction industry, in the textile industry, in the seafood industry. We see so many clusters of high ambitious heavyweight actors today moving ahead of the game. And I think that's potentially very significant, given that we have evidence, to close this, that transitioning to a zero carbon future, transitioning to sustainable futures, is no longer associated with sacrifice. It's associated to a very large extent with multiple benefits, both economic, socially, and health-wise. So we can make the case, I think, that transitioning towards, even if we see minorities transitioning, they can spill over to the majorities thanks to the fact that we have proof that they can succeed in a way that is more attractive.
Fantastic, thank you. And again, I think you've highlighted one of the entry points and contributions that the health community can make. As you said, that many of the things that we need to do will bring many benefits, and we would argue that the evidence for the health benefits is particularly strong and particularly important to policymakers and the general public. So that's certainly something we've been championing with from the WHO side. So thank you very much for that. I have questions piling up. The technical support has been fantastic up until now. I'm going to see if I can throw them by skipping from question 1 to question 5. So we have questions for individual panelists. So question 5 is specifically to Dr. Brahma. And how do you see the balance between global and local, in inverted commas, local actions addressing these challenges? And which governance organizations do you see, and what mechanisms would you like to have?
Thank you so much for this question. Of course, having already a kind of global action like Paris Agreement, and our countries, developing countries, or even developing countries signing this agreement, supporting it, and trying to implement the agreement in our countries, I think is a kind of global and local collaboration that can be encouraged and that is welcome. But of course, there are other collaborations that are needed. Due to the culture of the presentation, I was not able to show my last slide where I was showing those challenges. When you take, for example, the case of transport, how with good cars, with good strategies with public transportation, we can decrease greenhouse gas emission. It's good to have this agreement and the INDCs in our countries. But I don't know how we can manage that internationally. But I think there is a need to help weak countries, to help developing countries to control how international firms are coming and supporting them in implementing strategies for climate mitigation. I took the case of the metro of Abidjan. The country decided in Abidjan to build a metro way. And the first budgeting of this metro was around 900 million euro. From there, and we have on board Korean and European, mainly French partners on board to make it. And this took so long time due to political context. I will not go in, I will not jump in. Finally, the Korean partner was thrown out, and all partners on board are now from France. And from 900 million euro, we are now at 1.5 billion euro for this metro, making it one of the higher but really costly metro ever implemented, ever built worldwide. Of course, this is a private dynamic, but I'm thinking on a way how internationally there will be rules to try to catalyze this kind of things. When we take, for example, the agricultural product, taking, for example, cocoa, taking, for example, coffee, we have a cocoa board that help organize the cost of access. Can we think that it may also be a kind of shape, not let all the private making whatever they want, if the activity the countries want to implement may help for climate mitigation? Because mitigating climate, being in Europe, being in Africa, being whatever, is mitigating climate change for the world. So I think there is something, I may not have the concrete solution, but I will present this as a question on which I would like us to think too. How we can harmonize this one. When it comes to other challenge I raised, looking agricultural challenge, how we can encourage countries to go for agro, for agriculture, considering also the forest, how we can avoid food wasting. Some strategies are implemented, and those strategies may be reinforced through, for example, the green funds, for example, the green climate funds, and there is a need to build capacities, local capacity, in order to access those green climate funds that are available. And unfortunately, French-speaking countries are supporting the higher burden in their capacity to access those funds, because generally everything, English is now the, let's say, international language, you know. So when you are in an African country, and if you are in a French-speaking country, you are supporting a burden that is higher than other developing countries that can explain the problem in English, that can go for funds, look for funds using English and writing the proposal. So there is a real challenge of supporting developing countries, and the less the countries, for example, French-speaking countries, in accessing green climate fund, because this is also an opportunity how global strategies can help local actions moving forward. And I think I will start on those two examples, of how I may see global action supporting local action. We need to support countries to be resilient to private dynamic. I will synthesize it in such a way, to private dynamic, because the private dynamic are only built on economical logic. And not any economical logic is sustainable for the world. So there is a need to see how we can control a bit private dynamic that are economical oriented dynamic and not always sustainable. So yeah, this is what I can say from now. Thank you.
Fantastic, thanks, Brahma, and I'm really glad that we're able to keep the time to get your full input, because I think the examples that you give are really concrete ones, where you have a country which is trying to do the right thing, not only for its own population, but making a global contribution as well. It should be on the rest of the global community to support them, but if the mechanisms are not efficient, if there are barriers to them, or if they're only driven by short-term private interest coming in from outside, then that doesn't fix the problem in the end. So I don't think we're going to solve it here, but thank you for that, for putting that on the table. I'll now move to the next question that I have on my list, which is question 7. Again, to challenge the backup staff. Fantastic, they get it right again. And it's for Miss Omnia, and you can see it in front of you. Many thanks for using inspiration several times and being inspirational. How do you collaborate with non-medical students as UN Agenda 2030 and SDGs need interdisciplinary approaches? Over to you, Omnia.
Yes, thank you for the question. And I think COVID-19 has really taught us that health is a very cross-cutting issue. And for many years, we were also learning from WHO how, especially when it comes to climate change, how we should expand our collaborations beyond the health community, especially with young climate activists from different sectors. We always had the opportunity during the climate change conferences, as well as on other different occasions, to collaborate with students from a diversity of sectors. We do that because we are a part of the youth constituency for the United Nations Framework on Climate Change, but we're also part of the youth constituency for the UN. Both have youth from a diversity of sectors, and we try to come from a perspective of from the health side, we want to empower your advocacy. Benefits to what you're advocating for. And at the same time, we try to collaborate, and we just recently started collaborating with the forestry and agriculture students for the UN Food System Summit in their Action Track 2. And we try as much as possible to both either be involved with non-medical students within the UN, because again, the SDGs is a very diverse topic, but we also try to place health at the center of their advocacy and of their actions in order to empower it, and at the same time to be working together and not working in different silos. The final thing I want to add is that also, as IFMC, my organization, we are part of the World Health Student Alliance. So it's not just medical students, but it's also veterinary, pharmaceutical, and dentistry students. And we always collaborate with them, especially in the areas of climate change. But I really feel that it's always important to be multidisciplinary, and we always share our activities with them. And we also, the final thing that we did, and that was actually during COVID, we collaborated with the Environment Constituency of Youth, and we did a youth environment assembly, and they actually invited us because they wanted us to share our perspectives and our knowledge when it comes to the link between COVID and the environment. And we had over 200 students that were from the constituency itself. I don't think we barely had medical students, but we try as much as possible to engage with students from diverse sectors and youth in general, as well as other key stakeholders.
Fantastic, thanks, thanks, Omnia. Just to add a little bit to that, and why we think that your voice is so important in collaboration with others, is that I often quote the fact that surveys around the world show that the most trusted professions in the world are doctors. Doctors usually only just beaten by nurses, and depending which survey you look at, scientists are up there as well. So that's why it is so important for people like you and your constituency to speak out, but also I think to do it in the way that you're doing, which is not trying to claim that the medical point of view is the only one that you should listen to, recognizing that the real determinants are, come from outside, and we have to work in a multidisciplinary way. And it's again, it's one of the things that we think the IFMSA and in general the new generation of activists do so well. I would say, including from the environment side. So we see Fridays for Future demonstrators in India showing signs with lungs on them, making that connection that to clean air as well as acting on climate change. So yeah, thanks very much for that. So we'll go now to the next question, which I think I've flagged up as question 3. It's directed to Professor Rockstrom, but I believe that that others, our other 2 speakers, may also have something to say. The general question being, to paraphrase, that COVID-19 effectively brought some environmental benefits. How do we maintain those, as in many countries we're now coming out of lockdowns, or hopefully will come out of lockdown soon? Over to you, Professor Rockstrom.
Yeah, thanks for this important question, and it requires a kind of a quite elaborate answer. But let me start with the short, direct response, which is that it is under no circumstance of anything, it's nothing to celebrate that COVID-19, true, led to some bending of the curves, both in terms of reduced emissions temporarily, but also some reduced pressures on ecosystems, water, and even improved air quality. But it's nothing to celebrate. And it's very important that we, so to say, who are convinced that sustainability is the path to better human well-being, never use this argument, because it can easily be misunderstood. Because we know from experience over the last 50 years that a key reason why we haven't made more progress on the transformation or transition to sustainability is that we have too often argued for protection of the environment as a cost, as a willingness to pay, as the need for awareness, and even a certain level of sacrifice to modern lifestyles. And you can make that argument, and I have great respect for those environmentalists who still argue that we need to back off from our modern lifestyles. But I can assure you that if we are to turn things around in 10 years' time in the whole world economy, going through revolutions, an energy revolution, a food revolution, a nature revolution, a health revolution, then we need to get everybody on board. And to get everybody on board means to get the majorities on board. And they will join us if they see benefits in this journey. And if the communication is that COVID-19, the worst crisis since the 1930s, with massive job losses and massive impacts on the economy, is the only pathway to have clean air and to solve the climate crisis, then of course we're in for a very tough narrative. It's much better to say the following: look here, COVID-19 gave us a little peek into the future we can achieve. Look at how the life can be. Look at how New Delhi can have blue skies. Look at how we can actually, if we together collectively rise in the face of this challenge, we can actually reduce emissions by 7%, which is exactly the level we need to do every year now to follow the IPCC pathways towards a zero carbon economy by 30 years' time. But the way to do it is not to shut down the economy. The way to do it is to invest in sustainable solutions so that we can combine responsible human well-being and equity with this journey. I think that's the lessons from COVID. It's not to celebrate the sustainability impacts, but rather to say that's the future we want. We got a peak view into the future we want. And I think the biggest lesson to me is that, okay, 10 years back, everyone was saying it's impossible for the world to rise in the face of a global crisis. Well, we can no longer say that because we've done it. We've done it once. Why not do it again?
Fantastic. Thanks, Professor Rockstrom. If we can turn to the next question, question 4 on my list. And in fact, I think you've already touched on this. I was given a large part of your answer to this, Professor Rockstrom. So I'll turn to the other two panelists. And it's about engaging and awakening minds when there is resistance from leaders at the country level. How would the discussion be engaged in order to give a global view and implement a better plan when there are already so many pressing issues that national leaders need to deal with? So I'll stay in order. So if we can go to Brahma Kone, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm not sure that in all developing countries or even overdeveloping countries, there is a resistance from all decision makers to tackle the issue of climate change. I think there is a need to stress on the importance of acting for actions that may have value in 10, 20 years than only focusing on immediate return actions. This is the main issue. It's not because decision makers are not always aware of what is going on, But generally and unfortunately, they always go for emergencies and for actions that can come out with returns for them in the time frame of the elected period. This is unfortunately the case because generally, many decision makers, due also to the fact that the majority of the population are not well, let's say, educated, decision makers always stress on emergencies and on actions that can come out with return for them in the time frame elected period. They may not always build or act for actions that may come with result far from their own period. I think this is one thing I can confirm. Even in research, when you are making research, always the mayor will be happy when it comes to say that what you are doing is done with his support because he's had an electoral agenda in his mind. He may not see what you are doing as a researcher, the fruit of that for the communities in a long-term way, but it's just thinking to what he can get from that with an electoral strategy. So we may not confound the awareness of decision makers and their political strategy of generally focusing with the means we have of generally focusing on what is electorally oriented or strategically oriented, being to focus on something specific that can give return to us as decision makers. So we as researchers and other NGOs and other decision makers that are well sensitized and that support the cause of climate change, we should think to international strategies that give silos of doing to our decision makers. I don't know how we can manage that, but countries that may implement correctly some mitigation strategies should maybe be recognized at international levels with some kind of things that can make other countries plan to achieve the same as neighboring countries have done. But we should think to such kind of activities that may help our politicians not only stress on what can give them specific returns, but stress on what can make sustainable the living conditions of communities. I don't know if that was clear for you, but I tried to express it on my best.
No, thank you. I think you did that very well. I'll just turn for Omnia's answer to that same question, and then I'm going to try and squeeze in one more quick response to a final question. So if you can all keep your responses short, then we'll be able to tie up on time. So Omnia, over to you. The same question to you, please.
Yes, perfect. I only have 2 points to add. The first thing is that the question for me would be, how are we framing our asks to the decision makers, and how are we framing these asks to the public? Because I feel like working with local communities, we need to know how to tell a story in order to increase the public pressure, in order to make policymakers realize that our asks are urgent and we need to have urgent action taken. That is my first point. The second thing, I also feel that coming from Egypt and LMIC, there are many global solutions that I hear about during all these webinars and conferences that I attend, but it's always very challenging to adapt global solutions to a local context, especially in developing countries. And one thing I learned that it's also important whenever we are communicating with decision makers that we present them win-win interventions and solutions. Yes, they sometimes look at the short-term gains, and this is true, and in many cases it does not change, but we can also offer them this win-win and these co-benefits in order to have them drive the action and drive the change that we need. And one thing I also learned is that because there is still a very evident lack of communication between policymakers, between governments, between ministries. We always think whenever you want to do an activity on climate change, we need to go to the Ministry of the Environment, but then it's also the Ministry of Health, but then it's also the Ministry of Finance, and then there's a lack of communication between them, even though together they can actually drive the acts that we want to see happen and make them real. So we also need to use, as I was asked in the previous question, a multidisciplinary approach, but also not just talk to the policymakers, but talk to the public and give them our message.
Fantastic. I think this panel has been almost uncanny in almost answering the next question before you've been posed it. So if we can just have the final question up, please, which is question number 8 in my list. And it's basically around, most of us who are on this webinar are in the business of trying to generate scientific information, trying to get that across to people. This question suggests that just giving people more information is limited in its effectiveness. And then just if you could give me a 1-minute answer on what else you think we need to do. It doesn't need to be in relation necessarily to food practices, but what else do we need to do apart from just generating more evidence to get across to people? So once again, I'll start with Professor Rockstrom, please.
Well, to start with, I think both Brahma and Omnia has partly answered this question. I think Brahma through the on-the-ground examples, and then Omnia on the point, which I think is fundamental here, that we hold hands across disciplines and see, for example, I think health is the most important vector to decarbonizing the world's energy system today. I mean, in terms of lung capacity, in terms of multiple benefits for health is a much more powerful argument than the environmental protection argument, for example. So I think these are 2 elements. But my third additional point here is that I think there are two opportunities. One is one that we've touched quite a lot in this panel, which is the new narrative. The narrative of sustainability now increasingly proving itself to be the entry point for equity, security, prosperity, justice. It's the pathway towards success, to put it simple. But secondly, what we have not talked about in this panel is that individual behavior towards sustainability needs to be guided by policy, and we need to set the policies in a way that, I mean, just the simple fact of putting the right price on carbon and internalizing the price on externalities, so that when you go into the shop to buy your groceries, you don't have to think so much about what's most sustainable or healthiest even. You simply buy the cheapest, and the cheapest should automatically be the least planet damaging, because the only reason why the unsustainable products are cheaper is that they're subsidized by the planet, or they're subsidized by cheap labor, or they're subsidized by destroying our health. So as soon as we put full pricing on our consumption patterns, we kind of can get the indifferent majorities with us almost automatically, because they don't even have to care about the planet and still would do the right thing because it's becoming cheaper. I mean, just take electric mobility as an example. Electric mobility will rule the world, so to say, thanks to the fact, not because of the arguments from the scientists saying that we need to get rid of the combustion engine, but because it makes economic sense. There's less moving parts, 1/10 of moving parts in an electric engine compared to a combustion engine, so it's much cheaper to maintain, and it's cooler. It's simply a technologically more advanced system. So you don't even have to argue for saving the planet to go for an electric car. We're right at that tipping point now. So I think there are a few elements here that we can play with.
Wonderful, thank you very much. Brahma, your 1 minute final word.
No, I think it's. I really like the way Johan ended his speech. I think this is really, we may not need to always use the argument of saving the world, of fighting greenhouse gas emissions. Some specific strategies in convincing may be more useful than arguing with climate change ideas. So yeah, I really like it, and I think this is a very good point. And I don't have something to add from now. It's okay.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Brahma. That's very gracious of you. Yeah. Over to you, Omnia.
Yes, I also agree with all that has been said. The only thing I would add, and I feel it's very important, is leading that we know where everyone is doing in over 130 countries. And having this kind of space for us as youth and for countries around the world to share their best practice is really important. I think there are small local actions that happen, and this is what drives behavioral change. For example, a medical student that I know from Chile started posting recipes of plant-based diets every week to inspire her communities to adopt these recipes. So simple examples like this can drive change. Yes, we do a lot of research, but we need to transform this research that we generate to concrete action that can be done either on a very small scale, and it can also be supported, or on a national scale, or even better, on a global scale. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Omnia. Well, it just remains for me then to thank the panel. I'm supposed to be making a few sort of concluding remarks and trying to sum up. This has been an extremely difficult session to sum up. It really has been so incredibly rich. So you won't get the 5-minute version, you'll get the hopefully 1-minute version. That I think we've had a fantastic coverage from the big picture, from the planetary boundaries, describing the importance of maintaining the system as a whole, because from our point of view, that's what all human health depends on. We've gone through one of the most critical systems, the food and nutrition system, looked at how that interacts with both health and with staying within those planetary boundaries, talked about a big UN summit, which will hopefully put the world, or move the world towards a more sustainable direction in direct relation to that system, to food and agriculture, but also connecting that up not only to human health, but also to climate sustainability and protection of biodiversity. We've heard fantastic local examples, particularly the opportunities and the constraints from low and middle income countries, which are the ones which in many ways will determine the future of the planet and whether we stay within our global boundaries, because it's their development trajectories which have the most freedom for choice, I would say, compared to some of the other countries which are trying to draw back on development choices they've already made. And we've also heard from basically the importance of particular constituencies, and particularly the health community, and particularly young health professionals, how they can be effective and are already being effective in speaking up. And I'll just take a couple of quotes. One, well, I think both from Professor Rockstrom, one is health as potentially the most important vector for making the case for sustainability and for climate protection. We also see it the other way around as well. We argue from WHO that the Paris Agreement is potentially the most important health agreement of the 21st century because of these opportunities and because of the need, if you like, to stay within planetary boundaries in order to protect global health. And the other one that you mentioned on effectively that unless we make the choices that we need to make, the sustainable choices, the easy ones and sustainable ones, and the cheapest ones, then we may be doomed to failure. But as you have said, and it's also to come back to what I said at the beginning, within our manifesto for a green and healthy recovery from climate change, the last prescription we have is stop subsidizing pollution. And that relates both to the economic subsidies that go to polluting energy sources, but also to the fact that, as you put it, unless we make the polluting choices pay the costs that they are incurring either on the planet or on our lungs, for example, through polluting energy, we're effectively giving pollution a massive subsidy. And the estimates that we see are that the polluting energy currently gets a subsidy of over $5 trillion a year from the unpaid, mainly health externalities that they're not covering. That's more than all governments currently spend on health around the world. So that absolutely needs to be factored into it. The absolutely final word I had on this is that I was really encouraged that across all of our speakers, nobody sounded disheartened by the scale of the challenge. Nobody was put off in terms of by that question about what gives you hope. You all had an answer to that. So with that, just once again, just to thank the panelists for really, I think, a fantastic discussion. So with that, I'll just ask you to complete that poll and to thank not only the presenters but also all of you for attending what I think has been a great discussion. Thank you very much.